Good evening and welcome everyone to the nanoTalk on digital democracy, or rather challenges and chances for democracy. I'm Angela, and together with Clemence, I will lead you through this talk tonight.
Hello everybody from my side too. My name is Clemence and I will be with Angela with you tonight.
We are extremely excited to have two thought-provoking talks. And it is wonderful to see that there are so many interested people in this, in our opinion, really important topic. After a brief introduction, we will already get to the main part, the two talks. And in the end, you'll get a chance to ask some questions. Now, the nanoTalks are organized by REACH. And REACH is an organization promoting science communication towards the public as well as politics. And the importance of that we are reminded of on a daily basis with COVID-19 at the moment. The vision of REACH is to provide public discourse with evidence-based solutions. And one activity of achieving this vision is SIMPACT. SIMPACT is a program for students who want to share their passion and their knowledge, and at the same time feel the responsibility of having access to higher education. Clemence and we are both part of SIMPACT. We are an interdisciplinary group and we get a chance to participate in workshops and we organize events such as the nanoTalk tonight. REACH already has over 250 members in all of Switzerland. And if you are interested, feel free to check out our website or sign up for our newsletter. You can find more information on both in the description of this YouTube stream. And with that, over to Clemence.
Yes, thank you. We will start with tonight's topic of digital democracy shortly, but first we would like to add just a little save the date to our next nanoTalk on the 29th of April. Our two speakers will cover the very current issue of viruses and vaccines. And now back to tonight's talks with some practical matter. To ask questions, you can go to slide.do and enter this code nano-march. There you can ask questions and they will show up in a list. If there is one question that you particularly like and you want to make sure that we will answer it, you can also upvote it on this list. You can ask questions at any time during the talks or during the Q&A session, but we will first listen to both talks and then answer the questions. And now let's get started with tonight's talks. Angela will introduce us to our first speaker.
Exactly, thank you very much. Now, the first talk will be given by Ivo Bantel. Ivo is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Zurich. Having lived in undemocratic countries and illiberal democracies, he became deeply invested in the question of how to sustain democracy. Polarisation being, in his opinion, one of the most eminent dangers to democracy. That's what he's going to talk about tonight.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your interest and thank you for joining. I am excited to share insights into my ongoing research and the wider debate in political science about affective polarization, which refers to the dislike of political outgroups and has recently become more popular amongst political scientists. In the next 15 minutes, I will introduce you to the phenomenon and to its prevalence, and I will try to convince you that it has detrimental consequences that we should care about. So we all know the examples of political contests that are personal, that dehumanize the political opponent, and that go beyond mere disagreement. This phenomenon is at least partly captured by the term affective polarization. When we talk about polarization in general, we usually think of ideological polarization, which refers to political attitudes and opinions. But I want to focus on the other aspect of polarization, that is political affect, meaning the feelings towards other political actors. In short, this captures the dislike of political opponents and not just the usual disagreement with them. For example, this can show in the demands to imprison elected politicians without a trial, such as the images on the slide illustrate for both the United States and Germany. So I have given a first glimpse into the topic of affective polarization. In the remainder of the talk, I will first explain what affective polarization is and how we can measure it. Afterwards, I will talk about international context and how the phenomenon has developed in different countries. And I will then discuss factors associated with affective polarization, both on the country level, and then zoom into individual level factors contributing to affective polarization. And finally, I will give an overview of the consequences of affective polarization that we know about today. To start off, I want to briefly introduce the concept of affective polarization and explain how we measure it. In contrast to political opinions, we are here talking about feelings towards political actors, in particular parties. This is important because quite fundamentally, there might be a reason to disagree, even strongly disagree, with a party's political position, for example, on the environment or on taxation. And we need that in a democracy. If all parties and all people have the same opinions, then elections, for example, don't really work. But hating a party happens, for example, more for who they are and not for what they want. And that is a crucial distinction because the position could change. So we might at some point in the future disagree with the party with which we agree today. But dislike is less flexible. If we despise a party for who they are, this is unlikely to change, even if their positions are different tomorrow. We measure affective polarization by asking respondents the question you see on the slide, how much they like a party on a scale from 0 to 100. And it is important here to highlight that people give a different response to this question than they do to questions about agreeing with a party. So we are measuring something different here indeed. To illustrate how we get from the answer to this question to affective polarization in an entire country, let's focus on the United States. The United States not only make us think of fierce political competition, but it also has effectively a two-party system, which is very convenient since it makes affective polarization more straightforward to explain. The data you see here are the average respondents of people that identify as Democrats and that rated the Democratic Party on the scale that you saw before. So these are the in-party ratings of Democrats. Now, the same respondents were also asked how much they like the other party, the out party, the Republicans. Their responses are the lower line, and we see that these ratings are not only lower, but they also decrease over time. Now, to measure how affective polarization changes, we subtract these two values. This is the red line you see. This has a low starting value that increases, and that is the difference between how Democrats like their own party and how much they like the other party. And that is the value for the affective polarization that is evoked by the Republican Party. Now, we can also do the same thing for Republicans. The line on top is supporters of the Republican Party rating their own party. The line that starts in the middle is the rating of Republican supporters of the out party, the Democrats. And the blue line you see, again with a low starting value that increases over time, that is the difference between how much Republican supporters like their own party and how much they like the out party. And that is the level of affective polarization that is evoked by the Democratic Party. Now, to get a countrywide measure, we only focus on these measures of affective polarization, so these difference measures. In essence, we need to find a way to measure how much the country as a whole is polarized. And to do this, we calculate the weighted average. And we weigh the affective polarization towards the Republican Party by the percentage of votes that the Republican Party got in the parliamentary election in that year. And we do the same for the Democratic Party. The result is the black line in the middle that shows us the affective polarization index for the United States over time. This index has the advantage that it also works for multi-party systems, and thereby it is comparable across countries. So now we know how affective polarization is measured in a country, and we know how polarized the United States are. We have talked about the United States now because this is a straightforward example. In fact, political science research on the phenomenon has also only in the last couple of years started looking at multi-party contexts beyond the United States. But this leads us to ask, how do the United States fare in international comparison? This is the result from one of the first comparative studies from about affective polarization, and it shows values of affective polarization in different countries. The results show that the US are by no means the only country that exhibits polarization in affect. By contrast, the US are somewhere in the midfield internationally. Now, of course, this is only a glimpse at one point in time, but how has affective polarization developed over time? We can again calculate these indices for affective polarization for multiple countries over time. This is visualized in this figure, where each line represents one country and the United States are highlighted. A comparison reveals that the US is not an outlier over time either. When we calculate the average, it becomes even clearer that the US are on the one hand above average, and on the other hand, affective polarization is increasing more strongly in the US than it is on average in other countries. But importantly, the US is not an outlier, and affective polarization is a widespread phenomenon indeed. Now we have talked about the levels of affective polarization, and we have seen that it is intensifying in many Western democracies. But this begs the questions about the causes of affective polarization. Now, we can identify three factors that we can measure on the country level, which are connected to affective polarization. However, we need to be careful with our language here because we do not know yet if these factors cause affective polarization or if there is something else causing, for example, both of these factors and affective polarization. So we should speak of associations here instead of causes for now. But we do know that three phenomena are more pronounced in countries that also exhibit stronger affective polarization. The first of these factors is ideological. Countries in which ideological polarization is stronger are also more effectively polarized. This is especially true for countries where political positions on cultural issues are more polarized. Cultural issues include immigration, the environment, women's rights, minority rights, and so on. The second set of factors is economic. Countries with higher income inequality and countries with higher unemployment also exhibit higher levels of affective polarization. And finally, some political institutions are associated with higher affective polarization. The way votes are translated into parliament seats matters for outgroup hate. Countries with proportional electoral systems have lower levels of affective polarization than countries with majoritarian electoral systems. So a country where the percentage that a party received in the elections matches more closely their share of seats in the parliament, on average, shows lower levels of affective polarization. So these are the three factors that are associated with affective polarization on the level of countries: ideological polarization, inequality, and election system. But what happens more specifically on the individual level? What might drive individuals to dislike some parties more than others? This is an analysis based on surveys in different countries, where we focus on three different factors of further dividing up political competition of out parties, first into a left and a right camp, then along a left-right axis, and then distinguishing between far-right parties and non-far-right parties. We analyze how much each demarcation between different groups contributes to affective polarization. The first bar at the bottom in dark blue indicates the share of outgroup affect that is associated with dislike towards a party from the other camp. This shows that people don't just dislike out parties, they dislike out parties from the other camp more. The second, brighter blue bar, refers to the distance on a left-right spectrum. This indicates that people dislike out parties that are ideologically further away. And the third factor is a divide between the far right and other parties. The bar shows that there is quite some dislike between the far right and its supporters and the other political parties. If we look at the averages of these factors in the different countries, at the right side of the horizontal axis, then we see that each of these factors contributes varying shares, and also that a large portion is unexplained, which you see at the top. We can, however, also see that overall, around 20% of affective polarization are associated with political camps, around 25% with left-right distance, and around 20% with a divide between the far right and the other parties. Okay, we have now seen that affective polarization is increasing internationally and is associated with different distinctions between political groups. But what are the consequences of this? I will discuss this in the last part of the presentation and focus on the consequences of affective polarization. These consequences in the political domain are not established that well yet, so I will here illustrate 3 consequences in daily life outside of the political context. These findings are very much rooted in the US context, where most research on the consequences of affective polarization has been done thus far. First, affective polarization leads to political considerations influencing non-political decisions, such as finding a spouse or finding a roommate. So people prefer to live with and marry someone who identifies with the same party, which contributes to more ideologically homogeneous private networks. Second, affective polarization can decrease outgroup trust, which is the trust towards people from another group, here, supporters of another party. So all else being equal, Democrats trust Republicans less. And finally, because of negative outgroup affect, supporters of the other political party are discriminated against, and members of the own party are preferred. So to sum up, I have shown that affective polarization is what it is, and I have argued that it is increasingly prevalent internationally, both in the US and beyond. I have also discussed factors that are associated with affective polarization, both on the country level and on the individual level. And finally, I have shown some of the consequences that this political phenomenon has on daily life. Together, I hope I have convinced you that this is an important phenomenon that can endanger democracy and that we should care about. That's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Igor, for this very nice presentation, which I'm sure provided a lot of insights in the topic of polarization. Next up, we will listen to Sabria's talk on the links between AI and civil society. Sabria is a research and teaching assistant at the Global Studies Institute of the University of Geneva. If you want to create an algorithm for your own targeted campaign for the next elections, she might not be the best person to go to. But if you want to know all about what such implications could have on the democratic system, then she knows what she's talking about. With this, I will let you discover all about the promises and challenges of AI applied to participation in civil society. If you have any questions during the talk, you can post them again on slide.do with the code nano-march. I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion after the talk and hope to see many of you there. Sabria, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. First, thanks for inviting me to give you some insights about our research with my colleague, Jérôme Duberry, who is the research lead. So first, let me tell you that we are both available if you have any suggestions, comments, further questions about our research. So you can reach us through my email. Let me put this, yep. Here. So first, I thought I would introduce myself. So I have a social science background, so I'm not a technical person and I'm not able to explain you how AI works. But my question here is more about what do we do with AI as a society? So here I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of our ongoing research, and specifically we are writing a literature review about AI and democracy Nexus. And I am sure that you have a pretty good knowledge of how AI can harm democracy, and specifically we all have in mind numerous cases of political manipulation and surveillance mechanism. So these issues raise many questions about specific persuasion techniques and neuromarketing methods applied to politics. And even if manipulation and opinion influence is maybe as old as democracy, computational methods are clearly bringing more challenges and concerns. But maybe I will say a few words about how big tech companies have an influence in our daily life. So their commercial and business model is based on algorithmic recommender systems that make you stay on their platforms. At this stage, and probably you already know it, but as they aim to make users click more and more, we have to keep in mind that they want you to stay longer on their platform and buy products. So your attention and your time is actually very profitable for them. But they did not consider this before, and their business model does not take into account the content itself. Let's say conspiracy content or fake news content is not their concern, at least at the beginning of their business. And then on a political level, we saw how this happens through cases like Cambridge Analytica, which used Facebook's ad targeting system designed to beforehand for traditional commercial purpose, but at the end it had influence on election outcomes. So I'm sure that you would probably have a pretty fair knowledge of all these challenges linked to AI. So I'll try to focus here on promises and how AI can help to support civil society to engage more on politics, meaning that as we all can notice how citizens tend to distrust democratic institutions because they can find maybe that technocrats are in command and do not consider citizen needs, or maybe with the rise of populist parties and extreme right parties. And so AI could potentially stand as a tool to help citizens, or maybe if we go a bit further, to help us rethink and rebuild democracy as a regime, because some would think that democratic institutions were created centuries ago and do not suit anymore our modern world and the urgencies of our time. So AI could be such a great tool, for example, if we think about SDGs and how AI could act for social good or help scientists analyze data on biodiversity and so on. So basically, our work with Jérôme was to try to review the scientific literature to conceive a state of the art, and we did a thorough selection of articles related to the challenges of AI and democracy nexus, and then we categorized them into different main categories. And these categories emerge from the data contained in the selected articles. So we noticed that in the scientific literature, AI is considered into areas like political processes and citizens' opinion. So how can AI extract citizen opinion about politics to formulate social or political problematic into policies, or to evaluate these policies? But also, AI recommendation systems could actually stand as a barrier against false news. But I do not have time to go much deeper for this, but just for you to know. Besides, I wanted to give you a little bit of a context of why we need more citizen participation. As you noticed, maybe in 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic, contemporary societies are increasingly facing narrow political and social problems, which are referred in the literature as wicked issues, and which require a comprehensive examination of societal stakes, and which call from more complex solutions. So for this reason, political elitism and technocracy are no longer considered relevant when acting alone in the formulation of public policies. So here it is about supporting citizens to balance political views besides technocrats' views. But this can also be true for balancing media elites in a different context. So I want you to perceive political participation not only through electoral moments, but also to seize how citizens can can be involved in the construction of a common future through different tools. And here social media play a great role to mine opinion and sentiment about these wicked political and social problems. And citizen participation at this different stage, as you can see, for agenda setting, policy formulation, implementation, adoption, and evaluation. It is a recent trend that also allowed government to take greater account of citizen demands, to include them and to legitimize government decisions. So it is exactly here where AI could be useful with the data available on social media, in particular because they are a colossal source of citizens' opinion and feelings. So the following example of AI supporting citizens in political processes are actually tightly linked to social media and to opinion extraction. Here, as you can see, as a basic reminder, as I said, there are different stages of political processes, and this is exactly where AI can be useful. So as I mentioned, social media are a great source of information and communication between government and citizens, and their use has a great impact on policy processes. It impacts the first task of each policy cycle, which is problem definition and agenda setting. And policymaker can also discover problems in the society that need to be tackled. And also after, policymaker can measure not only happiness, but also opinions of citizens with regard to this policy, but also arguments supporting these opinions. So for instance, natural language processing and sentiment analysis are useful computational techniques to analyze textual data posted on social media by citizens. The extraction of opinion formulated on blogs, discussion forum, or social networks can make citizens' voice heard, but also about citizen reasoning and conceptualization of specific political issues. So it becomes very crucial asset for policymakers who are more and more aware of the lack of legitimacy and distrust of democratic institutions. And so before jumping in the specific example from our literature review, I wanted to share with you one example that you certainly heard during the sunflower movement in Taiwan. So I'm not an expert on social movements, but what I want to say is that they conceived an online consultation process that enables citizens to participate, which is called Virtual Taiwan. And the main goal is to let citizens participate online with the core idea to elaborate public policy from the bottom. So citizens are able to produce statements and then share with other users and submit these statements to a vote. So AI here serves as a tool to promote interactions between users, but also its main action is to analyze data contained in the statement and find similarities to bring consensus between citizens. So here I want to highlight that, as you may know, online discussion on social media tend to polarize people and create echo chambers where people would not find directly different views to nuance their position. They will rather find complete opposite views that will tend to create hate speech between users and polarize them. And this is one of the effects of big tech companies' algorithm. But here we see that algorithm can do the exact opposite and bring consensus between users to support their participation in policy-making processes. And so to go back to the policy processes and how we found that in the literature review, my first example from our literature review is coming from Huber and al., which is an article presenting the Twitter analytics for government intelligence and public participation. And the analysis of Twitter activity through visualization techniques shows citizens' interests and sentiment towards specific policy reform. And this Twitter analytics for government intelligence and public policy participation tool allow to seize different emotions such as trust, joy, fear, anticipation, according to the Plotchik wheel of emotion. Plotchik is a psychologist, and he made this wheel of emotion, and the researcher used this wheel to classify data on citizens' emotion, and also with word cloud analysis, researchers have been able to quantify data and to classify them. So according to the number of tweets, retweets, comments, or word repetition. So government have been able to identify salient topics. And similarly, I think of another example that I did not include here, but I think it's relevant to bring it here. So it's the approach of Parashar and Gupta, who extract and analyze citizens' opinion using support vector machines that allow to easily classify, in particular, citizens' opinion retrieved from microblog platforms such as Facebook or Twitter. And then they categorize opinions by age group and profession, which allows to consult in a targeted way the opinion of a group of citizens concerning policy measures that is intended for them, or that will have an effect on this specific social group. Thus, by being classified upstream, relevant opinion can be easily retrieved and used to empower citizen participation and support government decision-making processes. So I'll finish here and maybe give you two key takeaways. So there are still many open questions about transparency, fairness, representation when using AI, but there are many promises that are eluded. So I really invite you to consider these questions and think that there is no wrong or right answer, and we are still considering many opportunities and trying to figure out whether AI can be more corrosive than supportive to democracy. But we can also ask ourselves, do we want AI to be included in reshaping democracy? Is it something that we want as a society? Is it more useful than harmful? So I finally wanted you to think that as citizens or as researchers in social sciences, we do not understand how AI works, but as it has a huge impact on society, not only on democracy, but work, on art, etc. And as AI designers do not necessarily have all the keys to design it fairly and for social good, we need to all think about it and maybe, if not finding answers, but at least try to raise questions and provide opinions to advance research and designing of AI. And finally, I wanted to show you a short video from an MIT researcher, Cesar Hidalgo. So we started our research from this point. He mentioned the use of AI to enhance communication between citizens and between citizens and their representatives by reimagining the way we are represented. So I leave you with that, and then we can discuss about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these wonderful talks. These are very complex issues, and I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions and a very interesting discussion. I see that we already had a few questions in the chat. Maybe to start with you, Sabria, a question on your talk. There's somebody asking that if we use AI in policymaking, how do we avoid biases in their training to influence the outcomes with unintended effects? You're muted, I think. Sabria, can you hear us? We'll move on with a question to Ivo maybe first until Sabria can hear us again.
So Ivo, there's a question. In a society that has a tendency towards strong polarization, for example, because of poverty or a biased electoral system, what could be done in order to avoid polarization? And perhaps as a follow-up, if polarization already took place, what can be done for minimizing its effects, or perhaps even have a phase of depolarization?
Yeah, well, this is the million-dollar question, to be honest, and I was kind of afraid that this question would come up because it is very difficult to, at this point, to pinpoint to the sources and the causes effectively already, and even more difficult to pinpoint which intervention strategies we can think of to dampen or to address this phenomenon. In order to address the causes we already have, however, there are some policy instruments that we can think of. And just to recap, the three main correlates that we found so far are ideological polarization, at least in the cultural dimension. So about issues, for example, immigration and other issues that are related more to who we are as a society. And the more salient these issues are in the more polarized elites, which is elected members, politicians, governments, and parliamentarians, the more polarized and outspoken and extreme the views of elected politicians are on these issues, the more likely we are to see affective polarization. So this, taking one step back, in order to address affective polarization, one strategy could be to address these causes or these correlates. And the same goes for economic inequality and unemployment, which addressing these issues would have us expect at least a certain degree of decrease in affective polarization. Now, the third thing that is associated with affective polarization, which is the way that our electoral systems and the way our elections work, is much more difficult to influence since countries rarely ever change their electoral institutions. So this does not quite answer the question, at least to me personally. This is not a very satisfying answer, but this is the things that we can think of right now.
And maybe we can try again with a question to Sabria. I don't know if you can hear us. No, seems we have technical issue. But I had another question for you, Ivo, actually linked to Sabria's talk, because in your talk you mostly show that Sabria showed that algorithms can enable people to reach consensus more easily. And in your talk, it was more like about the opposite of consensus, right? So do you see this as a potential solution to polarization?
So thinking about, I mean, I presume that the question goes into the direction of social media and the way politics increasingly happens online. And this is a very difficult question to answer because there's a temporal correlation. So we've seen these tendencies in the last couple of years, and they coincide with the increase in affective polarization. One thing that there is suggestive evidence against is that merely the use of internet in a certain country increases affective polarization. So I wouldn't draw the connection quite that simply, to be honest.
Okay, I see. Thank you for your answer. I think we are back with Sabria. Yes.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't hear you, so I was completely out of the discussion. So if I have the question, the first one was maybe the best tool, maybe, or and why I choose the best promise I found in the literature review. Is that right?
Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah. So thank you for this question. So none of AI tools are perfect, and especially in the literature review, it is like always at the end of all articles we've reviewed, it is like nuanced that it's not perfect, and there is always a problem of transparency, of bias, and I think there is another question on bias. But as AIs work, AI works with and as a lot of black box, and even machine learning researchers or designers do not always get it, how it works, how it learns. So it's not completely perfect, but if I had to choose one tool that maybe is very useful for democracy, it would be maybe Botometer. It's an AI tool developed by researchers that is maybe very promising. So it's an AI-based tool that can help citizens to perform bot detection, specifically social bot online. So social bots are both acting like humans online, and they tend to spread fake news, disinformation, or conspiracy content. And this tool helps citizens to find these social bots online and to lessen the spread of fake news. I would say that this is one of the most promising tool, considering that we live in the post-truth area. So I would pick this one.
Thank you very much. I actually have a follow-up question on that. You were talking about tools that could help in democratic processes. But do you think that the problem that most people have with AI, I mean, many people are kind of afraid of AI. Do you think it's only due to the bad sides, the negative sides, or is it AI in general? Because you described it yourself as a black box. Do you think if it's for good purpose, then people might accept it more?
That's a very good question, actually, and that is the purpose of our research, to find out whether people would agree to use AI as I don't know if you've put the video of Cesar Hidalgo, but he is a very scientist and an AI enthusiast, and so he wants us to go very further in the way we can use AI and to be very confident. And I don't really know if we have to be confident in AI. Do we really need AI as humans to think about political systems? Or do we need AI just for medical purpose, for example? Is it more useful for medical purpose or for political purpose? That is a very good question, and I would say that And I wanted to add that this is a question that we will not answer maybe in the 50 years further, because AI is not ready, and it is not used in a democracy as it is presented by Cesar Hidalgo. But yeah, I returned the question. I'm sorry, because it is something that is very scary for everybody, and I understand that, because we as citizens do not understand how it works. But when we know that even AI designers do not understand how it works, how it learns, it tends to get a little more scary, and I totally understand that. But we have to see AI as a tool that could possibly help us take back power as citizens, because we live in a world where a small amount of people own all the powers, the financial power, political power. So it can be a tool, but it depends who owns this technology.
Thank you for this answer, Sabria. And now we'll switch back to Ivo. So there's a question about Switzerland, because you showed like this graph with the different levels of affective polarization in different countries. And this viewer would like to know whether you can explain this high degree of affective polarization in Switzerland.
Sure. So as I said at that part of the presentation, the measurement there is calculated slightly different to the way I explained it before, in the sense that there only the affective polarization as evoked by the two largest party, the one from the right and the one from the left in that particular country, is taken into account. And for Switzerland, that is the SD and the SVP. And since the SVP is like not just a center-right, but a far-right party, it evokes quite a lot of negative affect and affective polarization. And that explains why the measurement for Switzerland is so polarized for that graph. If you take other parties into account, which is also what the other measurements that I presented, the cross-country comparison, obviously Switzerland is not identified there, but it doesn't fare quite as high and is not quite as effectively polarized. However, effective polarization in Switzerland is still considerable.
Okay, and perhaps as a follow-up to that one, because, well, you mentioned that for this measure you only use like the two parties, the two biggest ones, but is effective polarization more pronounced in parties that hold extremist position compared to ones that are like rather center parties? Like you showed this graph on the individual components, and there you had like one distinction between the rating across the far right divide. So yeah, what do you think about that?
So there's two aspects to that. The one is the question whether people with extreme policy views are more effectively polarized, so the respondents and voters, for example, and the other question is whether parties that have extreme policy positions evoke more effective polarization. And we see evidence for both, although for the first, that people with extreme policy positions are more effectively polarized, that is a bit stronger of an association.
Thanks for this answer. Maybe let's go back to Savia with a very interesting comment from Ivo too. There's this question in the chat that if we use AI in policymaking, how do we avoid biases in their training to influence the outcomes with unintended effects? And Ivo also asked if we maybe precise a bit the term AI, because it's true in a question like that, it can mean everything and nothing. So Saria, what do you think?
Exactly, and thank you for that. I think I started to answer with the first question about bias. Unfortunately, AI designer, AI researchers, they all pretty much agree to say that we can have all settings that we want. We can have all guidelines, ethical guidelines to avoid bias. As we do not understand what AI does when it learns, we cannot completely be sure that there is no bias. And in the literature, in the scientific literature, we all know that the bias is not only in AI, but it can also be in the data. So as we cannot manage the data, because the data are linked to personal matters, and with the massive amount of data that we have today and that will increase in the coming years, we cannot handle the bias that is content in the data. So we have like more and more work that is done to create guidelines, to create a fair AI that is not discriminatory for women or for Black women or for Black people or for Asian people, and we try like more and more to have something fair. But at this moment, we cannot say that we can avoid for sure bias, because it is not something that we can grasp somewhere and say, okay, we will find a solution here because the bias is here. I would say that bias is everywhere. And I think there is another question about where is AI, and I will have the same answer. AI is everywhere. It's in your smartphone. It's in Spotify. It's in your search engine, as you may have seen in the presentation. It is in the search engines of Google. It is everywhere, and it is also in medical research to analyze data, and I don't want you to see all the only the manipulation effect of AI in the search engine, etc. I want you to think about all what we can do with AI. For example, I mentioned iBird. I don't know if I mentioned it in the presentation, but iBird is an application to for a researcher to analyze the how can I say that, to analyze birds and to see how they travel from a place to another place, and to make sure that they found what they need and to protect biodiversity. So here AI helps to understand what they need in specific points during their travel. So to avoid bias is one of the biggest questions for AI, and we don't have the answers yet. And if I see the question of Ivo about what is AI and what can we say of to give you a bit of a definition, every algorithm that works with big data to learn about this big data is assimilated to AI. There is many tools that use data and algorithm, but at the end it is not AI, because it's just like mathematical equation, and it's not learning about the data. The specific point of AI is that it learns from data, your personal data on Facebook or whatever. It learns from this data and it gives you a solution to a specific problem. But we have to know that every specific AI nowadays does only one task. If you say, for example, I create an AI and I want this AI to visualize, I don't know, a horse on Google, it will only do this task. Today we have AIs that do not perform multitask, they do only one task. I don't know if I'm clear about the definition, but please let me know.
I think it's as clear as it can be, though. That's also one big problem with AI, the way I see it. Nobody can really give a clear definition, but I think that was a very good, very helpful, at least. I don't know, I think Angela, you still had a few questions for Ivo, maybe?
Yes, so perhaps one question per speaker as the last ones, and then we'll already wrap up. But for Ivo, you've shown that affective polarization has increased over time. Can you explain what possible reasons are behind this increase?
Sure. So as I mentioned, or as I gave a glimpse on in the presentation, there are three main trends that we can identify. And the first one being ideological polarization, especially in what we political scientists call the cultural dimension. And this is basically about questions of who we are. So for example, migration, the environment. So basically the way life is structured. And we see since the 1980s in European political competition, we see a reorientation of the way political competition works from purely economic questions about redistribution, about taxation being the only line of competition, towards more competition on these cultural issues. So questions of immigration are more part of political competition in the last decades. And with elites becoming more polarized in that dimension of these questions, we also see affective polarization rising. So this is one tendency that has been going on for years that now is at least associated and correlated and potentially causing affective polarization to some degree. The second one, economic conditions and inequality, especially after the last economic crisis in the early 2000s, unemployment and economic inequality have been on the rise, as they have been for quite a while now. So this is the second big development that we can pinpoint to when it comes to the rise of affective polarization. And I think taken together, these two developments are really something that is very understandably leading to this rise in affective polarization.
Thanks. Techniques. I thought Angela had another question, so sorry for that. Thanks for all of these very nice answers. As Ivo said, he just gave a glimpse into this topic, and I think this is how we all feel about both of these very vast and complex topics that raise a lot of questions. So maybe my last question to both of you would be whether you have any recommendation for if people are interested to learn more, dig deeper into the topic, if you have, I don't know, podcasts, videos, papers, recommendation. I don't know, maybe Ivo first?
Sure. So I would recommend two books. The first one is called How Democracies Die. And this more generally talks about the way that extreme politics are endangering democracy, which is something that we potentially can all relate to. And the book recommendations are in the video description of the YouTube stream, so you don't have to type it down now. But there is also, if you don't want to read the entire book, because it is an entire book length manuscript, there's also an excellent podcast by a professor of political science here in Zurich, who's called Tariq Abu-Shadi. And he has this podcast called The Transformation of European Politics. And one of his episodes is with one of the authors of that book. So this is basically an hour of two political scientists talking about how democracy dies, which I personally find fascinating and I would highly recommend. So this is more on the polarization and democracy part. And if you are willing to dig a bit more deeply into affective polarization in particular and are willing to make it a bit more technical, then there's a great book called American Affective Polarization in Comparative Perspective, which gives a very neat introduction into the topic and into the state of the art of comparative research on affective polarization in, I think, a still very accessible way, considering that it is an academic book.
Right, thanks. It looks very interesting. Can't wait to dig deeper into that. Salia, did you also have some recommendations, maybe?
Yes, sure. I would say type on internet first, AI democracy. You will see that everything you will find would be very polarized, either very positive or very negative. And here you can try to find a balance. And I really invite you to read both cases, because if you only read that we are manipulated, you will be completely confident about that. But we as citizens have we have rights, of course, but we have to get to the information and do not stay passively waiting for information about AI, about all the manipulation and the challenges of AI. And if I have maybe one text, I won't recommend you a lot of books, because you can find plenty about AI and democracy. But one text is about constitutional democracy in the age of AI. It is not very hard to read, and it is academic, but it's not very hard to read. I think I sent it to you, Clémence,
Yes,
by
it should
email.
be in the video.
So if you want to send it, and maybe watch the whole video of César Hidalgo. He is very enthusiastic about AI, as I told you, but he's very provoking in his ideas, and maybe you will find a balance between all these information.
All right, thanks. Indeed, I think we put all of the links to the videos and papers and books in the description of the video, so you can find that. If you have any other question, you can reach out to us or to both speakers. I think they both posted their email address on their talk, and they would be, I'm sure, very happy to answer further questions. On this note, I thank you everybody for joining tonight. I remind you one last time of our next nanotalk in April, on April 29th, on viruses and vaccines. And yes, thank you again. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining.